read a second time. I call the member for Perth.
Thank you. In the last year, there has been a very interesting book, novel, published by a former West Australian, Joan London, and this was a book called The Golden Age. And Joan's novels are generally fantastic, and this one was no exception. And this Golden Age was a book about the polio epidemic in Perth, in Western Australia, in the late 40s and the early 50s. And for those that have not lived through that, or only have a vague folk memory from lessons and passed down from older generations, I think it is absolutely critical to read this book, to understand what happens when a community like ours, a sophisticated Western society, what can occur with the fear that comes with epidemiological disease, where the community can be highly fractured. I think one of the things that Joan London points out and captures extremely well in this book is that the fear, the anxiety that emerged from this disease, which affected vast numbers of Australian children, and I think it was 1 in 1,000 children ultimately contracted this disease. So parents were incredibly fearful of the impact of this disease, and it caused there to be a great 1 in 1,000 children were in Australia were indeed contracted polio, and Joan's novel showed the way in which fear drove some very, very severe reactions in the community, how it tore communities apart. People became suspicious of each other. People marginalised the other. If someone had someone in their family that had contracted this disease, there was was often a great deal of stigma attached to that, a belief that that family conducted themselves, their lifestyle was unhygienic, that they were in some ways lesser because of this disease. The difficulties families had just in the sheer dealing with the sheer physical disability that was created by this disease, and the establishment ultimately of these facilities where children would be basically exiled to for numerous years, and in many cases in that process becoming very separated emotionally from their families, and taking that with them throughout the rest of their lives. So it's really important, for those of us that perhaps have never lived through an epidemic, to understand just not only what the direct physical result of this is, and in the case of polio, I think it was 1 in 20 children that contracted it actually died, and many more had a disability that remained with them for the rest of their lives. So this was, so it's not just the direct physical impact, but then it is all the psychosocial consequences that can attend upon that. So really very important for us to consider what it is what this great mischief is that requires us to take a pretty hard line on this issue of vaccination. So on this side of the House, we have supported the no jab, no pay policy, and we do support this latest extension of that policy, which is removing the exemption on the basis of conscientious objection, We think that is something that is undermining the very nature of that policy, and we also are supporting the strengthening of the data that we have about the immunological profile of our community through the formation of and strengthening of the various registers that will give us a better understanding of the penetration of vaccinations. But I have had some letters of concern, and I think that there is some merit and some legitimate concern raised around the emphasis that is being placed, and perhaps on people of lower incomes, who are those that are by and large the recipients of or who have a reliance on these family benefits and various subsidies to which we are attaching the no pay, no jab rules. And I noted with interest the member for Higgins, representing largely a very wealthy area in Melbourne, noting that in her electorate there is some of the lowest immunisation rates, and that indeed reflects the research that has gone on across Australia, that indeed it is those wealthier areas that indeed have the lowest rate of immunisation. And I think that this is a question that we are going to have to address. We need, for the effectiveness of these vaccines, in respect to highly contagious diseases, to get proper herd immunity, we need about a 95% coverage rate, and for diseases that are still communicable but perhaps not as readily transmissible, we need a coverage rate of around 90%. Now, I think that it is only fair that we ensure that if I can call it a burden, this burden of ensuring that level of herd immunisation does not fall disproportionately upon those people who are in the lower income brackets. And so I do think that we need to keep ourselves very much alive to who is being immunised and who is not. And we do, in fact, have another lever available to us if we do not see the immunisation rates increasing equally across all socio-economic groups. And I would put it to the government that, just as we quite rightly and with the full support of the opposition are looking at the family tax benefits and the childcare payments as the leverage point, that it may well be, if we continue to see this disproportionate level of vaccination, that we should also consider attaching it to the subsidies that the federal government pays directly to government schools. Because I do think, as I said, this is a really important issue. We need to ensure that we do have these vaccinations rates up there, but we must make sure that this is spread. The task of ensuring that we do that is spread evenly. I've had a very personal experience of this. I had my daughter when she was only 4 weeks old, before she was obviously capable of having her first shot, contracted whooping cough, and it was a really quite horrific experience to take this very small baby into the hospital and learn that she had clearly struggling and had this condition, and she had exposure in the weeks before to a child whose parents had not immunised that child, and so it's quite possible that that was the source of her contracting whooping cough. So I do think, we have got this great vulnerability. We need to understand that the scientific evidence has overwhelmingly shown us that this is that the benefits of this vaccination program outweighs the risks, and of course, with everything that there is some risk. There are no free lunches in medicine, as there are no free lunches elsewhere. But when we look at all of the scientific evidence is really showing us that overwhelmingly the benefits outweigh the risks, and that we do need on this issue to be putting the rights of the community before the rights of the individual, because it is only as a community that we can stamp out these illnesses. This can't be something that becomes purely a matter of personal choice any more than the issue of paying tax becomes an issue of personal choice, although with some of our tax laws, some of us might be forgiven for believing there's an element of choice for at least some within our community. But again, really important legislation, really important that we develop a very sound policy and that we have the data, the database that is going to enable us to understand with great clarity just exactly how we are going in terms of this coverage, so that we can really plan our health policies around that. But as I said, just to repeat, I do think that we have to look very closely at the reality behind the reflection that was made by the member for Higgins about the groups in society that in fact may not be pulling their weight in an immunological sense, and look at how we can apply other Commonwealth levers, financial levers, to ensure that they are brought into the fold, into the herd, along with everyone else, to make sure that we do get this right. Thanks very much.
Thank the member for Perth. The